Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're throwing ourselves headfirst into the birth of punk, specifically 1970s New York and London.
Yeah, it's a great topic. We've got some really interesting material, online discussions, personal takes, but also historical stuff on fashion, key venues.
Right, and the mission today is really to dig into whether punk actually meant different things, or maybe felt different, in these two kind of crucial cities. See if we can get under the skin of it.
Absolutely. And what jumps out almost immediately from the sources is this idea that, punk wasn't just one single thing back then. The online chats especially, they really highlight these distinct vibes coming out of New York versus London right from the start.
Okay, so let's dive into that difference. A big question that kept coming up online was exactly that. Did NYC and London just have fundamentally different takes on what punk even was?
Seems like it. And New York, well, it often comes across as the more sort of artsy scene, doesn't it? Really tangled up with the whole downtown bohemian thing.
Yeah, you think about people like Lou Reed, Mapplethorpe, even Basquiat later. They were all kind of moving in the same circles as Debbie Harry, right? Part of that broader counterculture.
Exactly, that's key. New York had this history, Beats, Warhol, the Velvet Underground, a legacy of artistic rebellion.
So the early punk scene there just tapped into that energy.
Kind of looks that way. It attracted people with art school backgrounds. Someone on Reddit mentioned members of Talking Heads, for instance. And you had figures like Debbie Harry, Patti Smith, already in their late 20s, 30s even.
Right, bringing maybe a more, seasoned artistic viewpoint.
Possibly, which feels quite different when you look at London.
Yeah, the picture painted there, especially in some of those online accounts, it's much more politically charged, fueled by a real specific kind of anger.
One person even called it bogus rage, which is, well, that's quite a statement.
Yeah, strong words. But the general feeling you get is that London punk was this direct reaction, really vocal, against the politics, the economy in the UK then.
Someone described it as brewing in a pub atmosphere, which paints a picture.
Yeah.
Maybe a bit more raw, more grounded in everyday frustrations.
And that context is crucial, isn't it? London in the mid-70s. Rough times, high unemployment, social unrest. You can see how punks could become this, howl of protest.
Definitely. Whereas New York, the city had its own problems, for sure, but the early punk focus seems more tied to specific places. Art hubs, like Max's Kansas City, and of course, CBGB.
And CBGB, that's funny, the history says Hilly Crystal didn't even want punk there initially. He was thinking country, bluegrass, blues, CGBB.
Right. It was the bands themselves, the rock bands, the early punk bands, that kind of forced this shift in direction.
Yeah.
Serendipity almost.
And this connects back to the age thing too, maybe. In New York, you had these slightly older artists, Debbie Harry, Patti Smith, mixing with younger musicians.
Yeah, established names, in a way, compared to what seems like a younger, maybe more purely reactive wave hitting London.
Which ties into that idea from the Reddit threads, this suggestion of a more live and let live thing in US subcultures versus maybe something more confrontational in the UK.
It's an interesting thought. Someone even floated the idea that the UK's drinking culture, the role of the pub, might have played into how that frustration got expressed.
Yeah.
Aggressively, maybe.
Could be. It's a fascinating lens, that contrast between just doing your own thing and actively confronting the status quo.
For sure. And how culture shapes the way you rebel.
Okay, let's zoom in on the music itself and the venues. CBGB in New York. Undeniably central.
Absolutely. Ground zero.
Started with those country blues ambitions, like we said, but just became this amazing melting pot. Ramones, Television, Patti Smith, Blondie, Talking Heads, all rubbing shoulders.
And that's what's so cool about CBGB, right? It wasn't designed as a punk club. It was just open.
Yeah.
Open to new music, weird music. So you got this incredible cross-pollination.
Totally. And the Ramones, their story's wild. Coming from Queens, first playing Beatles covers, Mod Faction, Joey Ramone as a glam rocker called Jeff Starship.
Yeah, hard to picture. It really wasn't until they got together as the Ramones, started playing CBGB, that the sound clicked. That super fast stripped back thing.
And the look changed too. Away from mod, towards the t-shirt, jeans, leather jacket uniform we all know.
It really shows how organic that early NYC scene was. They weren't ticking boxes for a genre called punk. They were just finding their own noise,
Yeah, apparently their early shows weren't always hits either, but CBGB gave them that space to figure it out.
Exactly. Meanwhile, London gets the Roxy Club.
Right. And the Roxy, one of the histories points out, was set up specifically for punk. A dedicated space.
Yeah, punk could call its own, I think was the phrase. outside the usual boring gig circuit. That intentionality is a big difference from CBGB's origins.
It shows there was already a movement in London needing a home base. Generation X played the first gigs there, setting the tone.
And you can't ignore the impact of the Ramones' first album landing in the UK. It just lit a fire, gave a blueprint.
It's so interesting seeing that back and forth. When the American bands, like the Heartbreakers, Wayne County, played the Roxy's American Week,
Yeah.
they apparently came across as a bit more showbizy, more theatrical than the UK bands.
Ah, okay, so even the performance style felt different. US bands maybe still had a bit of that rock and roll showmanship, while the UK bands were more direct, more urban, political.
Seems like it, which really underlines that divergence again. Both rebelling, but maybe how and why they were rebelling differed.
The nature of the rebellion itself, yeah. Okay, so how did this play out in, like, the look, the fashion?
Good transition, because punk fashion on both sides of the Atlantic was definitely a statement, a deliberate up yours to mainstream excess.
Absolutely. Anti-materialism, anti-glamour. It was a visual uniform for the anti-establishment vibe.
In the US, the early look, according to Wikipedia and just, photos, it leans towards unkempt, right? Ramones uniform, like we said, or television, Patti Smith kind of thrift store, secondhand clothes.
Yeah, it feels almost like an anti-style statement. Simple, raw, like the music. One online comment linked it to making art with, like, limited resources.
Yeah.
Not flashy.
But then you look at the UK, wow, so much more deliberately provocative, often offensive even. You got to talk about Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren.
Oh, absolutely. Their shop, SEX, was crucial, pushing boundaries like crazy.
Think ripped clothes, safety pins, but also those t-shirts, the Destroy tee, with the swastika and the upside-down crucifix, shocking stuff.
And the Snow White one, incredibly subversive. The UK fashion seemed aimed squarely at offending and provoking a reaction from, polite society, using taboo imagery as a weapon.
The DIY thing was there in both places, but in the UK it felt more aggressive, like tearing things apart and sticking them back together to make a statement. Apparently, Sue Blaine's designs for Rocky Horror were an influence too.
Right, that theatrical, deconstructed look. And specific items become iconic UK punk, don't they? Leather jackets, sure, but also customized blazers with slogans, heavy boots, creepers, bondage trousers.
And the hair. Deliberately messy, often brightly dyed. A real visual code.
And that visual difference kind of continues into the 80s, even as things splinter. US hardcore goes super basic, utilitarian t-shirts, jeans, work boots, almost anti-fashion.
Yeah, a reaction against the perceived excesses of even early punk sometimes. Well, in the UK, you still have elements of that 70s visual aggression in oil and street punk.
We have to remember, like the sources say, punk wasn't just one thing. You get all these subgenres popping up with their own looks. Anarcho-punk, all black, militaristic.
Crust, yeah.
Right, or crust punk, super DIY, patched up. Glam punk, adding glitter back in. Shows how diverse the whole thing became.
And interestingly, mainstream fashion picked up on it really quickly. Designers like Xander Rhodes, Gaultier, they were incorporating punk elements pretty early on.
Which speaks volumes about its cultural impact, right?
Yeah.
Even as they tried to reject the mainstream was like, ooh, interesting.
So let's tackle this tricky question about the label itself, the word punk, and the influence. Was there really a coherent US punk scene before the UK kind of exploded?
Yeah, that's a really key debate that pops up. The argument some make is that the early NYC scene, well, it was more just a collection of bands. Interesting bands, sure, but linked more by geography, CBGB, Max's, than by a unified sound or look or youth movement.
Like, the Ramones didn't exactly set the US charts on fire initially.
Exactly. Their impact was maybe more cult, whereas the sources point out the UK seemed to get bands like Television, Blondie, the Ramones quicker. They got more attention over there early on.
It's almost like the UK amplified what was happening in New York.
That's one way to look at it. And Malcolm McLaren's role is often highlighted here. He was so good at packaging UK punk, giving it a strong visual identity, an ideology almost.
Yeah, creating an image, which maybe the early Bowery scene didn't have in the same way. It felt more localized, less branded.
Right, so the sort of revisionist take is that the US scene only really started to see itself as a scene, gain that coherence after the UK phenomenon hit, and that influence bounced back across the Atlantic.
Interesting. So the UK didn't just invent it out of nothing, but maybe they defined it, forged those New York sparks into something more recognizable, more impactful culturally, at least initially.
That's definitely an argument that's out there. It suggests the UK's genius was maybe in the branding and the channeling of that raw energy.
Okay, so bringing this all together as we wrap up.
Yeah.
It feels pretty clear, doesn't it? New York and London were both absolutely vital, ground zero for punk. But the initial sparks ignited differently?
Yeah, very different flavors. New York, you've got that art school connection, the bohemian downtown scene, maybe slightly older players filtering in.
And London just feels more raw, more politically charged, driven by that working class anger maybe, and visually defined by that really confrontational DIY fashion pushed by people like Westwood and McLaren.
For sure. And then, of course, the music and ideas start bouncing back and forth across the Atlantic, and things get more mixed up, more interconnected. A global punk thing starts to emerge.
But those distinct origins, shaped by the specific social vibes, the economics, the art scenes, they left their mark, didn't they? You can still kind of feel the difference in the DNA.
Definitely. And the fact we're still talking about it, still trying to figure out the history, shows how potent that era was.
Yeah.
In both places.
So here's something to think about. When you look at all the different sounds, the different looks, that got called punk, just in those two cities.
Yeah.
What actually makes a movement? Is it like a shared look, a shared ideology? Or is it just, I don't know, a spirit, a feeling of rebellion, no matter how it shows up?
That's the big question, isn't it? What holds it all together? It's definitely worth mulling over.
Absolutely. And hey, the best way to explore it is probably just to dive into the music Ramones, Sex Pistols, The Clash, television Patti Smith, and look at the photos, the documentaries from that time.
Listen to it, look at it. You might find your own answer in there.